buenos días. Les damos la bienvenida a todos al foro Integración sociolaboral de personas migrantes, contribuciones de
So
la
I'd like to welcome
migración al
everybody
desarrollo
to the
sostenible.
conference
Muchas gracias a
related to
todas las
sustainable
personas que
development.
nos
Thank you.
acompañan
I'd
hoy
like to thank all the
presencialmente
people that are
y
here with
también
us
a quienes se
presentially,
han
and
conectado a
also
través de
those that
nuestra
have
transmisión por
connected through
streaming.
our transmission
Bueno,
through streaming.
recientemente, a
First of all,
principios de julio,
at the
el
beginning of
gobierno
July,
lanzó la
the
Política
government
Nacional
launched
de
the
Migración y
National
Extranjería
Policy on
y que
Migration,
considera, entre otros
and
ejes, la
this considers,
integración de
among many
personas
pillars, the
migrantes al
integration of
país.
migrant people
Y en
to the
tiempos
country.
donde este fenómeno
And
ha sido
in times where
abordado
this phenomenon has been
principalmente desde la
tackled
seguridad, con
mainly
el
from
enfoque en el
the
control de
security point
fronteras
of
y
view,
prevención de
with a
ingresos
focus on border
irregulares de
control
personas
and the
migrantes, nos
forbiddance of
parece
irregular
fundamental
migration,
ahondar
we
también
believe it's
en la inclusión
fundamental to also
sociolaboral de personas
tackle
migrantes,
inclusion in
considerando que
these social
llegada puede
and work
abrir
areas, considering that
oportunidades
this
para el
can
desarrollo
open opportunities for
económico,
the further
educacional y cultural
economic,
de nuestro país.
educational, and cultural
Queremos
development
agradecer
of our
muy
country.
especialmente a
We
la
wish to
Embajada de
give a
Canadá en
special
Chile
greeting
por su
to the
apoyo en el
Embassy of
desarrollo de este
Canada and Chile
foro
for its
y al
continued
Centro de
support of this
Políticas
forum,
Migratorias,
and
con quienes
the
hemos llevado adelante este
Political
proyecto y
Migrant
del cual nos
Policy
contará más detalles
Center,
su director
who we will
ejecutivo,
hear
Juan Pablo
from their
Ramazzotti.
executive
De la
director,
misma
Juan Pablo
forma, quiero
Ramazzotti.
dar gracias
In the same
a
way,
los
I'd like to also
expositores
thank
y
all the
panelistas que nos
speakers
van a
and
acompañar
panel
hoy, tanto
members that will
presencialmente
be
como por
here
Zoom.
with us
Y
today,
ahora, sin más,
presentially and
dejo con
through Zoom.
ustedes
And
a
without
Michael
further
Kort,
ado, I will
embajador de
leave you with
Canadá en Chile.
Ambassador Michael Gort, Ambassador of Canada in Chile.
Buenos
Thank you
días
very much,
a
Paula.
todas y a
Good
todos.
morning, everyone.
Es un placer estar aquí en
It's a
Espacio
pleasure to
Público
be here with
para
you in
abordar un
Espacio
tema en el cual
Público
yo
to
tengo
tackle issues
estrechos
where
vínculos o con el cual yo
I
tengo estrechos
have
vínculos personales. Yo
close
nací en Canadá,
personal
pero mis
relationship
padres
with. I was
fueron
born in
inmigrantes
Canada,
que en
but
algún
my
momento
parents were
buscaron
immigrants,
la
and
paz, buscaron
back then they were
oportunidades
looking for
económicas
peace,
y llegaron
opportunities,
a
and
Montreal,
they arrived to
donde
Montreal,
yo
and
nací
well,
y eventualmente
that's where I
crecí.
was born, eventually growing up
Quiero
there.
agradecer
So
a nuestras
I would like
participantes canadienses,
to
en
thank
especial a
the
Christine
Canadian
Binney
participants,
del
especially
Ministerio de Inmigración,
Christine
Refugiados y
Binney from
Ciudadanía de Canadá,
the
así
Ministry
como a Mónica
of
Albercader
Immigration
de la
and
Asociación
Refugees
de
and
Nuevos
Monica Belcare
Canadienses, que se
of the
unen a
Society of
nosotros
New
virtualmente
Canadians,
hoy
which
desde
are joining
Ottawa
us
y St. John's,
online through
Newfoundland.
Ottawa and St. John's,
También
Newfoundland.
gracias a José Tesada
Also,
y
I'd
a
like
Luis
to thank
Taller por
Jose
acompañarnos
and
en
Luis
esta
Taller
importante
for
discusión.
accompanying
Si bien la
us in
situación
this
migratoria
important
en Canadá
discussion.
es
Even
muy
though the
diferente a la
immigration
de Chile,
situation in Canada
nuestros
is very
dos
different from the
países enfrentan
situation in Chile, both
desafíos
our countries
bastante
are
similares, yo diría,
facing
para los
fairly
cuales la
similar
migración
challenges
representa una
to
parte de
which
la solución.
migration
Ambos
that
estamos
is a
lidiando
part
con
of the
tasas de
solution.
natalidad bajas
We
y
both have low
decrecientes, una población que
birth rates
envejece
and dropping birth rates,
y
an
que pondrá
aging
cada vez más a
population,
prueba los
and that
sistemas de
will
salud,
put to
sectores
test
laborales,
all the
así
health
como la
systems
escasez
and labor
de
systems, as well
mano de obra en
as
determinadas
the
regiones e
scarcity of
industrias.
labor in certain
Si bien dar la
areas and
bienvenida
industries.
a un gran número de recién llegados en un corto periodo
Even though
de
giving
tiempo es difícil, y eso lo
and
hemos visto aquí
opening the
en
country
Chile,
to a great number of migrants in a short time is
puede conducir
challenging,
también al rechazo
and
público
this can also
y político
cause
de los
public
y las
rejection
inmigrantes por
and political
parte de algunos
rejection
segmentos
by
de la sociedad.
some
Los
sectors of
beneficios
society.
a largo
The
plazo son
benefits in the long
enormes.
term are
El mensaje que
enormous.
quiero dejar con
That's the basic message I wish
Por
to
eso
leave
es tan
all of you with.
importante
And that's
la
why
integración
it's
rápida
so
y
important to
eficaz
have quick
de las y
and
los
efficient integration of
migrantes y
all
recién llegados
the
en sus
immigrants
comunidades
and
de
recent
acogida.
arrivals in
Me alegro
their host
particularmente que tengamos a la
communities.
participación en este
I'm very
seminario
happy
de
to
una
have the
organización canadiense
participation of a Canadian
que se enfoca en el
organization in this
asentamiento
segment,
y la
which is
integración de
focused
migrantes
on
en
the
el
settlement
recogimiento, perdón, en el
and
este de
hosting
nuestro país,
of
en áreas
immigrants
fuera de
in
las
the
grandes
east of
regiones
our country,
metropolitanas de Canadá.
areas outside of the great
Las
metropolitan
dinámicas
areas of
y las
Canada.
experiencias son muy
The
distintas.
dynamics,
Un buen
experiences
ejemplo
are
de
very different.
reasentamiento
A good
exitoso
example
nos
of
proviene justamente
resettlement that
de
has been successful
Nova Scotia,
is from
otra provincia de
Nova
esta zona
Scotia,
marítima, a la
another
cual llegó la
province of
familia
the
Haddad
maritime
huyendo de la
provinces
guerra
of
en su
the
país
Haddad
natal,
family
Siria.
that fled
Y con
the
el fuerte
war
apoyo
from
de su
Syria
comunidad de
with their
acogida, la
family.
familia fundó
And
la
with their
chocolatería
host
Peace by
community,
Chocolate,
they
Paz por
founded the
Chocolate,
chocolatery
que hoy por hoy es
Peace
una
by
empresa de gran
Chocolate,
renombre en
which
todo
today
Canadá,
is a very
y uno de los
well-known
tres
company in
empleadores
all of
más
Canada,
importantes del puerto
and
de Antigonish.
one of the three most important employers in
Asimismo, al
Antigonish.
apoyar a las personas recién llegadas,
And that's
para
how
encontrar oportunidades
to
laborales legítimas que
support
les permitan
people that have
contribuir a la
recently
vida
arrived
económica y a
with
través del
labor
involucramiento de las comunidades de
opportunities
acogida
and
en la
to help them
integración positiva,
become involved positively
podemos
in their
comenzar a
communities,
contrarrestar las
and
narrativas
thus
negativas
we
en
can
torno a la
counter
migración
negative
para
narratives
también cosechar
around
los beneficios de la
migration
inmigración
to
de
also
manera
harvest the
más
benefits of
rápida.
migration
Y sin
in a
detenerme
quicker
más,
manner.
agradezco al trabajo de
And
Espacio
without
Público
further ado, I'd like to
en
thank
organizar este
Espacio
evento y
Público
espero que sea una
for their
discusión
work in
satisfactoria.
organizing
No
this event, and
olvidemos
I hope
que
this will
todos
be a fruitful
somos
discussion.
migrantes.
Let's not forget
Gracias y
that we're
merci.
all
Thank you very
migrants.
much.
Thank you very much. Merci.
Hola, muy buenos días. Gracias, Paula, gracias, Espacio Público.
Good
por la
morning. Thank you very much.
colaboración para hacer este evento. Gracias a la
Thank
Embajada
you
de Canadá
for the
también
collaboration
por
for
trabajar
this
en
event.
este espacio.
Thank you for working
Gracias a
together
compañeros
in
del
this
panel que
space.
nos
I'd
están
like to
viendo hoy día.
thank everyone
Como mencionaba
in the
Paula,
panel.
este es un
As
trabajo
Paula
que nosotros
said,
estamos
this is
generando a
work
partir de un proyecto más amplio
that
que
we're
busca
creating from a more
visibilizar y
ample
también
project
identificar
that's
espacios donde
creating
la migración
visibility.
hoy día es una parte del
And
desarrollo sostenible y
here
también
we
espacios
need
donde se podría
sustainable
potenciar aún
development,
más los elementos en que la
and
migración
we need
está
to
aportando al desarrollo
power
sostenible en los
this,
países.
and we need to
Particularmente
help
nuestro
sustainable
trabajo se
development
está
in the
enfocando
countries.
en cuatro dimensiones que son
And
economía y trabajo, que es de lo que vamos a
we're
hablar hoy
focusing
día,
on four
salud y
dimensions:
cuidados,
economy and work,
educación
health
y cohesión
and
social.
care, and
Ahora
social
lo que voy a hacer muy
cohesion.
brevemente para dar paso al panel
And now
es
what
identificar
we'll
algunas
do
áreas
quickly
donde la migración puede
is we're
ser
going to identify
de
areas
manera más
where
significativa un
migration
aporte al desarrollo sostenible del
will
país
give
y también algunos datos de
and
contexto
contribute
que
more
permitan
significantly,
enmarcar la
and
conversación.
we'll have context data that will help with this.
No me está funcionando el- Bueno, primero nosotros nos marcamos en los objetivos
Okay,
de
first
desarrollo
of all, we
sostenible,
are framed
específicamente
in
en este
the
tema,
Sustainable
el
Development
octavo, que es
Goal, in
trabajo,
particular
desarrollo
in
y
this
crecimiento
topic,
económico,
the
donde hay
eighth, which
énfasis
is
especiales que
decent
hacen
and
los
economic growth,
ODS
decent work and economic growth,
en el progreso
are
económico de los países,
special
en el crecimiento
emphasis
inclusivo,
that
con énfasis en la protección de los
is
derechos laborales y particularmente
that do
en la
with the
protección de los
emphasis in
derechos laborales
protecting
de
labor
personas
rights and in particular
migrantes.
protecting the labor rights of immigrant people.
Algunas áreas donde en general
Some
los
areas
aportes que la
where, in
migración significa
general,
para el desarrollo
contributions
son
immigration
el
means for
equilibrio entre oferta y
development
demanda, en que
are balanced between offer and
principalmente
demand,
en
where
sectores donde la
mainly
oferta
in
de
sectors
mano
where
de
the
obra
offer
local
of
no satisface la
local
demanda de
labor
trabajo, la
force
migración
don't
puede aportar
satisfy the
equilibrando
labor demand.
esa relación,
Migration may
también
contribute
aumentando la fuerza
balancing
laboral
that
y el capital humano
relationship,
de los países
also
a partir de la
increasing human
formación
capital and labor force of
y la
countries
cantidad de
from
personas que aporten al
training
trabajo,
and
lo
the
que puede
number of
también
people making a
aportar a
contribution to
aumentar la
the
productividad del
labor,
país.
which also may
También
contribute to
respecto del
increasing
desarrollo
productivity of the
empresarial,
country.
el
Also
emprendimiento
regarding
y la actividad económica
entrepreneurship
que se
and
pueda
business
producir a
development
partir
and the
de
economic
la
activity that may be
inversión, la creación
produced
de
from
negocios y el
investment,
intercambio
creation
entre
of
los países de
businesses,
origen y
and
destino
exchange
y los
between
aportes que implica la
origin and
migración para los
destination
sistemas de
countries, and the
seguridad social
contribution
y la
immigration implies
recaudación
for
fiscal.
social security system and fiscal collection,
Algunos
tax
temas donde
collection.
también es importante poner
Some
atención
topics where it's also important to pay
respecto
attention
de
to
desafíos y posibles tensiones que puede
regarding
implicar la
challenges and
migración en
possible
cuanto al
tensions
desarrollo
immigration
económico, al
may mean
mercado
regarding
laboral
economic
y a la
development,
integración
labor
sociolaboral es
market,
qué
and
impacto
social
puede tener la
labor
migración
integration.
en cuanto a
This is the
desempleo,
impact of
en cuanto a los
immigration
niveles de
regarding
ocupación del
unemployment
país,
and the
si es
labor
que hay o no
levels
un
or occupation
impacto
levels of
positivo o
a
negativo en los
country,
salarios,
whether it is a positive or negative
cómo se
impact
maneja
on
la informalidad en
salaries.
el trabajo en contextos de
What is
migración, dependiendo de distintos
informality
elementos,
managed like
y
in
también cómo se
immigration
puede
context
abordar la
depending
precariedad
on
laboral
different
que
factors,
existe en
and also
contextos de
how
trabajo
to
de personas
address
migrantes.
labor precarity, which is also given in context of
Gracias. Ahora,
immigrant people.
algunas cifras específicas respecto
Now,
de
some
ocupación
specific
y
figures
desocupación. Esto a
regarding
partir de la encuesta
occupation
CACEM,
and
que es la encuesta
unemployment.
de
This is
caracterización
from the CASEM
socioeconómica
survey, which
que
is the
realiza el gobierno de
socioeconomic
Chile generalmente
characterization
cada 2 años
survey
y que
by
se
the Chilean
los
government,
resultados se
usually
publicaron
every 2
recientemente.
years, and
En
the results
ocupación de
were
personas
recently
migrantes y no
published.
migrantes acá
In
nacidos en Chile
immigrant
y
and
nacidos en el
non-immigrant
extranjero, vemos que en general
occupation of
las
people
personas
born
migrantes
in Chile
presentan
and
niveles más
abroad,
altos de
we see
ocupación que los no
immigrant people
migrantes
show
y
higher
si
levels
bien la
of
diferencia
unemployment
no es
than
mayor,
non-immigrants, although the difference is not so big.
menores niveles de desocupación. Si lo
Lower
miramos
level
entre
of
hombres y mujeres
unemployment. If we
migrantes,
look
hay una
between
brecha
men
ahí en
and
que
women
hay mayor
immigrants,
niveles de
there's a gap
ocupación en
that there
hombres
are
migrantes que en
higher
mujeres migrantes
occupation levels in immigrant men rather compared to immigrant women, and less level of unemployment in men compared to women. If we look at between the period immigrant people arrived to Chile, we can see there is no clear relation between the period and unemployment levels, but those who arrived starting 2020 show higher unemployment levels. Regarding the economic sectors with the largest number of immigrant workers, almost one quarter is in the trade or the commerce or retail sector, and around 10% in accommodation and food services, in manufacturing companies. Here it is working, thank you. And in construction. Regarding revenues, if we see comparing different Casen service updated revenues, as of November 2022, we see there's a trend, a decreasing trend in the real income of immigrant people on average, and an uptrend in the revenues of non-immigrant people, and it is reversed the trend that immigrants had higher income than non-immigrants. Today is the other way around. If we look at the gender, there's a gap that immigrant men have higher income compared to women. This gap has been closed because this is explained because men has decreased their salaries and women had increased. According to the time people are in the country, the longer they're in the country, the higher the investments.
With respect to the salaries of hired and immigrant workers, in general, there's not much differences between migrants and non-migrants, men and women, but there is an important difference with regards to the percentage that has no work contract compared to people that have been in the country for a few years, and more than half of the salaried workers don't have a work contract. With respect of the self-employment, there's not much difference between migrant and non-migrant. The trend, according to the period, is the more time they spent in the country, at least until the last decade, the more time the person has in the country, the more they worked by themselves, even though in the last few years this trend has been reversing itself, where those that have arrived recently have self-employment. And now, employment per qualification, immigrants that have higher education but that are employed in a job that requires lower qualifications. In general, migrants present a self-employment with higher qualifications, which is double than those that are non-migrant. Now, in the last 3 years, it's gone up to more than 80%. So even though there are many areas where political policies can present challenges based on this data, we can focus on 3 areas. What happens to the people that arrived in the last few years, where there's a greater level of unemployment, greater level of informal work, how we cover the gaps in gender and in migrants, and what happens to underemployment due to qualification, which is an important opportunity for employment and migration. Thank you. I will start with Patricia Dominguez.
Gracias. Bueno, vamos ahora, la idea es tener una conversación.
The idea here is to have an open conversation on the challenges of integration of migrants in the labor market. I'm a professor of the Catholic University in Industrial Engineering and Systems, and I also direct one of the groups that studies migration, sponsored by ANID, the government agency, called Migra. Now, since we have Luis Eduardo Tayer, the director of the National Migration Service, we have asked him to give a few words. I believe that there are many things that are happening in migration, so we'll hear Luis Eduardo. Please, Luis Eduardo. Wherever you wish. Microphone, please. So the questions that call us to this meeting.
Son bien amplias, por decirlo así.
They're very ample.
El trabajo no entronque en lo laboral, en la
So
inclusión
this
laboral. Quisiera partir por hacer dos
has to
reflexiones
include labor inclusion. I want to give
digamos, cómo
more general
cuadrar con la
reflections
relación laboral desde
on
la
how
política, desde la
to
labor que
include
realizamos nosotros en particular en el
the
servicio
labor and the
nacional
discussion
de
that we have in the National
migración, ¿cierto?
Service for
Los desafíos
Migration
que hemos
and
enfrentado y cómo
the
los
challenges that
abordamos.
we faced and
Ahí
how
la
we're
primera
tackling
reflexión
it.
que es muy importante
There's a first
respecto
thing
de, digamos, el encuadre
with
migratorio
regards
tiene que ver con que
to the
la
focus of
normativa,
migratory
a diferencia de
policy,
otros fenómenos,
the
a diferencia de
norms,
otras normativas, en este
which is
caso,
different from other
la normativa
regulations.
por decirlo así, una
This
eficacia material muy limitada. O sea,
has
busca
very
regular un
limited
fenómeno
efficacy. It seeks to regulate a phenomenon that's very liquid, which is very difficult to regulate, which is different from other regulations which have immediate applicability, which
Here we can, for this, here we have
we need to establish frontiers which has this, and it's going to be always present. An effect of this lives in all the countries which receive migrant persons, and that's irregularity. And here, the regulations are built to avoid this. Irregularity is something that affects all the countries that receive migrant persons, which this is a difficult phenomenon to govern. So there's a particularity where this obligates us to study that criteria, the policy, the migration policy, and the regulations that seek to norm it. So among these norms that seek to regulate it and this reality that escapes, we have politics, we have the migratory policy, and this will consolidate what we have and where we have capacity to reduce the margin of inefficacy. So, if I'm just going to place an example with respect to our regulations, the law for immigration and regulation and matters of inclusion in labor, they established a separation between the supply and the demand. Why? Because here we have the supply, demand in Chile. Here we have the demand, and the supply is outside. People have to come either with a contract or with the supply on hand. They have to find a job being outside the country. So the labor and challenge that we have in this area is to join both things together. Those workers that are in their countries and those employments and jobs available in the country for them get together. Without policies, that's very difficult. Without migration policies, that is left out, and it's up to individual decisions, market decisions, and the processes which are more structural that the countries live in. So in matters of migratory policies, one of the main challenges that we have today with regards to labor inclusion is to get together offer and demand of workers with employment. So in this sense, we have advanced in many initiatives, and one of them seeks to make available supply of jobs, offer of jobs for those immigrants that are requesting residency and informed to their country of origin. Now, for temporary residencies, it's necessary to have a contract or an offer, and the people receive this back in their country. So, in the moment they request that position, that's where we have to come in and join these two together. We have coordinated with the Ministry of Labor. We have a project that's implementing, and it's going to be implemented the first quarter of next year, so that people that apply to temporary residence can at the same time apply to a job offer and to access contracts. To that end, we're working with the national job market so we could cover difficult coverage positions where there is a lack of employment, and that way we can help the immigrants receive temporary residence. This is a more structural aspect that helps us face this relevancy given the separation due to the lack of a more efficient law, especially with regards to this phenomena that it seeks to regulate. Point number two, there's another challenge that's very important which has to do with the situation. It's a more political challenge, and it has to do with the aspect of labor inclusion. Before the government came into administration, the types of work and labor that came up, there were many work groups, and there was a work group that was focused on migration. We group of people that worked on the installation of alignments and objectives in the short term in migration matters. And there we saw a discussion which was the following. What will be the focus? What will be the focus? What will be the things that we'll do, and what will be the narrative that we'll try to install? And here's another particularity that we see in migratory policies due to the political phenomenon. We know that migration in public arena is instrumentalized by political sectors that use it in order to capitalize on elections, etc. There is also a territorial mission, which is very important. There are stakeholders that have links in territories that have a greater presence of migrants. They will also present a different discourse. This isn't so much left or right wing, but rather territorial. So I believe, thus, it's important in this discussion that we had there to relay the separation of dimensions of what we will say about migration with regards to what we will do. What's the premise? The premise is that migratory policies that are invisible, a migratory policy that doesn't have presence in the public arena, is something that can advance quickly in the focus of rights. A migratory policy that's very visible from the rights point of view will make the public arena arise with those thoughts that they're coming to take away our jobs, etc. So that's one part. The second part of the diagnosis is viability. One of the concerns of citizenship is viability of migration. So we have to advance towards rights and inclusion in a context where making it invisible was impossible. Therefore, we had to decide on the narrative and the formula, and we have two pillars for the narrative. Narrative with action that, in one way, allows to advance in a more silent manner, in a more, let's say, more permanent, more sustained manner, with a focus on rights and inclusion. And one of these pillars was, I'll say it in a very simple manner, it linking immigration to contribution to the country. It may sound utilitarian, but it's a very simple way of stating it. So we're going to defend the migrants' rights with a discourse that migration is necessary to develop the country. And that was a decision where inclusion in the labor market of immigrants and the evidence of their contributions in the economic development of the country is a key factor to politically contain this topic. That is the first pillar. Evidently, that is supported by the law, and the law clearly establishes that there has to be an important aspect, and one of the law that we had to implement has this pillar in immigration and contributions and development. So the proposal is to advance with that narrative, and the other narrative that has been fairly evident, the other public discussion topic that we've tackled aggressively in the political containment of the topic is the topic of security. We've had important costs in our sector, in the world of organizations, in the political sector, in carrying out important work to explain how important it is to talk about security, not leave it out with respect to some aspects of immigration, for example, border control. This, for example, during the pandemic came up. Security and migration was a topic that came up. We can't leave it out. And apart from advancing in migratory policies, apart from implementing this, we have to have the security of the country, and we need to advance in these lines and play with these narratives. So instrumentality and to have measures in security, if we discuss to depth beyond just a headline, these are all reasonable and necessary to be able to have a migratory policy that in the end can fulfill the objective of the slogan, which can be to regulate, it may be to organize, it may be to create safety for people, for migrants and non-migrants, people that migrate and people in the territories that receive the migrants. So that would be unfeasible if we do not have border control. Migration is unfeasible that fulfills the objectives of regulation, consistency, without having a registry, without a certain rationality, and to make it safe for both the migrants and non-migrants. And that doesn't imply insecurity in the territories that receive migrants or the areas through which migrants transit. Something that has happened before and that still happens. These are complicated topics in the tackling, and therefore we need to roll out more concrete measures. I just drafted one, which is the National Employment List for agency, and we understand that the capacity to control borders is different than others, such as the Chilean capacity for border control is different, the state is different, the focus is different from Canada. Canada has a refugee system that's very well endowed. It has a lot of investment in this. They have great regulations, and they have great regulations in labor and the relationship to immigration. So there's a great difference between Chile and Canada in the way of measuring the labor market and identification of needs. We're advancing towards those lines, just like European countries that have identified the jobs of difficult coverage. I believe that that's a key point in the narrative that allows us to face this idea that the narrative that they're here to take away our jobs. So we talk about jobs of difficult coverage. There's, for example, 80,000 positions in Chile in agriculture that Chileans don't want to cover. And these, being honest, these are harder conditions in salary, stability, safety that are compared to other sectors. So here, according to Canadian experience, it's a good learning experience, and of course we can discuss aspects that have been performed in Europe and Canada. That's a general sense. Thank you very much. The idea is to have an interactive panel, and we have Christine Ini, who is the Senior Director of Strategic and Horizontal Policy and Planning from the Immigration Refugee Organization of Canada. So Christine will present. She's connected here, and we will put up the presentation of Christine, and we should be able to hear her presentation. Christine, are you on?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, pretty well. So the floor is yours, so you can start now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invite to speak today. I'm really happy to share a bit about Canada's experience. Yes, please advance to the next slide. So just to say, I'll give a very brief overview of Canada's immigration system, but it's because I want to focus on kind of that whole of society approach to newcomer integration. I will talk about the federally funded settlement programming. This was just previously referenced. Yes, it's very expansive. So I wanted to mention that with a link into the employment related services. And I'll talk about community connections and partnerships and services targeted to particular populations who may face extra barriers. But I'll also touch on social and economic outcomes for newcomers and some of the key challenges we see in moving forward. So next slide, please. So just high level, Canada has been an immigration receiving country since Confederation. We've welcomed over 19 million people, and this has really contributed to a growing ethnic, linguistic, and religious diversity in our population, which we very much view as a great source of strength. In 2022, we welcomed more than 431,000 new permanent residents, and this is the most in a single year in our history. Next slide, please. I'll just quickly mention here, Canada, we do have a very strong legal framework that's supported by federal policies and enshrined in equal opportunity and the promotion of full and equitable participation in society. You can see a number of legislative pieces here, and that really gives us the foundation needed to have the successful settlement and inclusion of and integration of newcomers to Canada. Slide 5, please. Thank you. So I just glossed over the legal framework, but it does provide this foundation for Canada's approach to integration of newcomers, and it's premised on social inclusion and a shared effort of and responsibility between newcomers and Canadian society. And this includes many partners and stakeholders. With respect to newcomers, we very much do expect newcomers to take ownership of their settlement and integration journey by using the many supports and resources available to them, making social and employment connections within their communities, and of course, abiding by our laws and policies. On the societal side, we do have the settlement and resettlement services. We have multiculturalism programming, labor market programs, health, education, social services. So it's very comprehensive. And in Canada, there's the federal and the provincial and territorial governments that all share responsibility in immigration, settlement, and the labor market. The provinces and territories there do provide mainstream supports related to education, health and social services, skills, and also the labor market training that's essential to newcomer integration. And then there's municipal governments and civil society play a big role, as you can see on the slide as well. Next slide, please. So just looking at the federally funded settlement program, we do see the successful settlement and integration of newcomers as an essential component of our managed migration system and crucial to attaining our broader objectives like economic growth and prosperity, but as well as building an inclusive and cohesive society. It's since the 1990s that Canada's federal government has funded settlement services to provide newcomers with the supports they need to help them feel welcome in Canada and in their communities and integrate into the Canadian labor market and society. Our services help them overcome barriers to their specific experience, so lack of official language and knowledge of the workforce and different aspects like that, which we try to address through our services. All permanent residents and protected persons as well are participants or can be participants of the settlement program. They can receive these free government funded settlement supports. And our evidence really does show that this federally funded settlement program supports newcomers in achieving very positive economic and social outcomes. In 2023-24, the government plans to invest, and we're on track to invest $1.1 billion to support the settlement needs of newcomers. We use a third-party delivery model, so these are settlement provider organizations. We fund over 550 of them across the country to deliver the services and programming to a broad reach of newcomers. Our provinces and territories and also municipalities also provide some funding to settlement provider organizations. And so there's this close collaboration between the federal, all levels of government, just to ensure complementarity of our service offerings. Slide 7, please. So you can see here, there's a wide range of services being provided to newcomers, and that's from pre-arrival, before they're even in Canada, and continuing all the way through their integration journey until the acquisition of Canadian citizenship. So there's a list here of the services and the supports. So, you know, everything from, as I mentioned, pre-arrival, but critical needs and assets assessment and referral services early on. We have language services, employment I'll get to in a minute, very important community connections, some of these support services that, you know, facilitate the access to other services are also offered. Next slide, please. So just a bit more on employment-related services. They aim to equip newcomers with skills and supports for accessing the Canadian labor market. And this includes essential skills training, work placements, mentorship opportunities. There's job search skills and job matching services as well, employment counseling. So you can see it's fairly comprehensive. I'll move to slide 9, please. So another key part of Canada's settlement program are the services that foster connections with local communities and partnerships to coordinate community efforts. Community connections services aim to build bridges between newcomers and their new communities, focusing on encouraging newcomers to fully participate in Canadian life while engaging institutions and community members to build welcoming and inclusive spaces. This allows the newcomers to develop a sense of belonging while also enabling community members to better understand the contributions that the newcomers are making and then support also their integration. We have these local immigration partnerships, and they play a really important role in fostering welcoming communities. They bring together through cross-sector collaboration and planning, they bring together a wide range of stakeholders, including municipalities and other levels of government, employers, schools, health centers, ethno-cultural and faith-based organizations, and other local partners to really create a community effort. Next slide, please. We know that some newcomers definitely arrive with more barriers and disadvantages. And so a priority for Canada is to foster inclusion by providing targeted supports to newcomers who may face multi-barriers to their integration. And we do this in a number of ways, as you can see here on the slide. We have targeted settlement supports. We also have tailored settlement services. Next slide, please. And then there's another element critical to the integration of newcomers. It's this place-based approach, which really helps to share the benefits of immigration across Canada and increases the probability of retention in those locations, rather than having the secondary migration or overwhelming certain larger centers. And so we have some programs that have been very successful in, so one of them, the Atlantic Immigration Program. This is really looking at increasing the role of the employer in the settlement of newcomers. We have the Rural and Northern Immigration pilot, which offers meaningful economic opportunity. So that could be a job offer, but then coupled with community supports to really give the newcomer a greater sense of belonging, and that really we see does increase the probability that they will remain in that community successfully. Next slide, please. So overall, the outcomes of immigrants to Canada are very positive, both from an economic and a social perspective. Immigrants play a key role in raising the education level in Canada, actually. And over time, most immigrants establish themselves economically and play a large role in the labor market across Canada. From a social perspective, newcomers demonstrate comparable levels of voting and volunteering and charitable giving compared to those that are born in Canada. We have a newcomer outcomes survey, which reaches to all newcomers and really evaluates how they're doing. And we see a large majority of newcomers, in fact, almost 90%, really feel a very strong sense of belonging to Canada. And Canada has a high citizenship acquisition rate among eligible permanent residents at 83%, which is one of the highest globally, actually. So we see that as a big success. And then also, importantly, a reflection of this successful integration is that public support for immigration in Canada remains as Canadians continue to recognize the benefits of immigration. Slide 13, please. However, of course, there are always challenges, and with the combination of the higher immigration levels that we're seeing, the unpredictability of global crises, and in general, a more complex immigration landscape, it's had a big impact for sure on newcomers and their settlement needs. And it raises economic and social challenges. In particular, we see this in housing and social service pressures on the social services. So we know we need to build capacity to respond to human crises. That's one of the pieces that we really need to look at. We see that it's not just the increase in levels of immigration, it's the mix of that, the rise in number of refugees, which is linked to multi-barriers for their integration. We do see anti-racism and equity issues growing in public awareness in recent years. And of course, that kind of permeates across the economy. We see that in the labor force. But we know that Canada's mature and very evidence-based policies and programming is the foundation we need to address these ongoing challenges and meet these emerging needs. Thank you.
We're going to expand the panel now. Now I'm going to invite Jose Tizala to come up. He's the director of the School of Business of Doctorate of Economy of MIT, and one of the experts in Chile on migration in Chile. And it's going to be a very fruitful dialogue because Jose knows the Canadian experience in one way or another. And to this panel, we'll be joined also by Monica Albercale, who's the director of Settlement and Resettlement Association for Canadians, and connect both panels with a connection. Well, I think we are highly motivated, especially having Ambassador Michael Ward, who kicked off the motivation behind migration. There's perhaps geographical challenges, not just thinking of the past, but also thinking of the future generations. I believe that's a challenge for all countries. And I believe that out of what I will take away from the two presentations that we've seen so far is that we in Chile truly have a very recent problem, and the challenge of migration is not just going to be fixed by a regulation. This is a comprehensive challenge which requires the joint efforts of various state apparatus and civil society to carry out assimilation, as is known in literature, and a true integration, not just thinking of those that arrive, but thinking of those communities that receive them. I believe that was very enlightening from the presentation that we just saw. It's an effort of not just giving a visa and just giving people papers. It requires effort and a decision behind the country. So I believe there we have a long ways to go. So the question, this panel has the challenge of seeing how we shorten the gaps in migratory policies between Chile and Canada. Perhaps that is the focus. There were some questions that were sent to the speakers. I'll read them out loud as well. But let's please consider this connection of how to close the gap in as migratory policies as we saw in both places. Okay. So one of the questions, I'll read it in English. So then we're going to start with Monica's presentation. I believe she's already connected. So Monica, if you could please start, and then we'll give the floor to Jose. However, we must finish at 10:30, so I will be hard on everyone just so we could fulfill the time slot. I hope we could fulfill it. Please, Monica, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us, to both the embassy in Chile from Canada, but also for Espacio Público for having us. Yeah, we received discussion questions. There's so much that I think we could get into and talk about as the Chilean society works on really establishing their next steps. And a big congratulations for your policy. From what I've read, it looks like it's going to be a really interesting way to address a lot of the challenges. And here I really want to kind of focus on these discussion questions and talk about a little bit more about how the multi-level governance system here works. And Christine did a really lovely job giving us that overview of what does the federal government do versus what the provincial and municipal governments do in Canada. But when it comes to actually supporting the successful outcomes of immigrants and more specifically of migrants, because from what I understand, that is the majority of the population that you're looking at, I find that this, in my experience, this provincial and federal partnership that we work with has been instrumental in that. And I'll give you a few really important examples. And to start, I think Christine mentioned the Atlantic Immigration Program. We also have a provincial nominee program, which is similar in that the province, the local region or the provincial government is able to identify which newcomers or which labor market priorities exist in our province, and then work with the federal government to regularize temporary foreign workers or also bring people from overseas to Canada through the immigration program. And exactly as you suggested, attach them to jobs. And those jobs are jobs that are ones that we need to address our labor market challenges. So I find that multi-sectoral, multi-governance way of intervening to support newcomers is something that without both levels of government coming together, I don't think we would see the same levels of success. On that front, we do at the Association for New Canadians have had quite a history working in the space of immigration. We have been around for over 40 years. And one of the kind of key pillars, I think, that really make our work very special and very impactful in the province as one of the leading providers of settlement services, and one of the funded service providers that Christine mentioned, has been the leadership that the organization has taken over time. So we have established quite early on in the immigration movement in Canada, we established a provincial coordination table that brought together all of the relevant players, both in terms of those people working on this as a policy project, but also those more on the ground connected to newcomers as they're coming. And it's something that we take quite a lot of pride on, that we were actually one of the first provinces through this initiative, this collaborative initiative in our province, to actually establish our localized immigration strategy for the province, which has gone on to feed a lot of the work that we've done, including quite recently with Ukrainian arrivals who arrived on work permits as a humanitarian program. So it was unique in that it wasn't a resettlement program where were people arriving with permanent residence, but they're arriving for temporary residence and having to find jobs in order to be able to be successful here. And here we've seen a lot of labor market success. We've seen a lot of folks be able to attach successfully to jobs in our communities. We're finding a lot of employers are so excited to work with us because they are desperate for labor, but also desperate for the exact kind of labor that Christine talked about. People that have the skills, the training, the education that immigrants often bring to our communities. So we've been quite blessed with this being the largest immigration movement in our province's history, to see that people are moving not just to our capital city, but also to rural communities, remote communities where labor is needed most, and where labor needs have often been filled in either precarious ways or through things like temporary foreign workers who are brought in on a temporary basis to fill labor market gaps. Employers are telling us everywhere that they're really interested in seeing how they can keep building on integrating newcomers that have that are looking to stay, that are looking to make their lives in Newfoundland for the rest of their lives, and they really are working with us in very close collaboration to ensure that success. Part of what we do at the association includes looking at how we integrate immigrants, refugees, and other migrants into the labor market, but not just by connecting them with a job. So our work starts sometimes even pre-arrival, as Christine talked about, with certain populations, but definitely from the moment that they are looking for work here in the province. We do everything from helping people get accreditation, helping them develop a resume, which can be a little bit different, learning how to navigate interviews. That was a really big lesson that we learned from the Ukrainian population, for example, that in Ukraine, interviews are typically a done deal once you get to the interview rather than a conversation about a good fit. And so a lot of that requires some new learning and some support to help the newcomer be successful in their job search. But that doesn't just end there. Once they get that job, our work is actually, a lot of our work is around job maintenance and around the wraparound supports, be them social services, housing support, mental health services, interpretation, translation of documents, that we make sure that they are able to sustain that job, but if they're not able to sustain that job, that they're able to get connected to good employment. Another really good example, or a point that I think is really worth making as you embark on this next phase of your work, is around temporary residence and labor exploitation. So here we see, again, a lot of important collaboration between the different levels of government, both the federal and provincial government, but also on the ground, on a more local level. We have a rapid task force here at the association that we pull together that includes law enforcement, border control, lawyers, and social workers that help to create interventions for people who are experiencing human trafficking, but not necessarily only, not exclusively sexually based labor or human trafficking, but what we're seeing more prevalent numbers is labor exploitation. And one of the concerns always around temporary foreign workers or temporary residency, when tied specifically to a closed work permit tied to a specific employer, is that sometimes if that relationship isn't healthy, the newcomer can feel stuck in that with that employer, or feel that they have no options to leave from that situation. And we know that while most of our employers really do try their best to help with integration, not every situation is actually quite healthy. So what we've actually seen is that with the feds, they have developed specifically, like IRCC has specific streams within the immigration program around human trafficking that allows us, when somebody is in a position of having a closed work permit tied to a specific employer and their residency attached to that specific employer, but that when something is going wrong, that we have a mechanism to get them temporary residency, and that allows us to get some time to help them connect to a new employer and re-enter the process. So that's a really important kind of like a safety net, that as you're working to develop new interventions, as you're working to look at how can we work with residency and employment, to just be mindful of the fact that there are going to be situations, there's going to be people with vulnerabilities, there are going to be times where that job is not going to be actually the right fit, but people are doing it because they need humanitarian responses as opposed to labor market responses. And those create very challenging situations. But as I said, what I can say with certainty and with a lot of pride is, working both with IRCC and our provincial government, we have seen every situation brought to our table come to a good resolution. And I think that that is as a result of this significant experience that we have as a country working with this population. The last point that I'll leave you on, not to take up too much time, but also just to talk about kind of this idea about assimilation and integration in our community. And I think when I've spoken to other governments, or when I've been thinking about this problem locally, what I often see is the two-way nature of that. And I think, as someone who arrived as an immigrant, my family arrived as immigrants, I think that what is beautiful about Canada is not just that people assimilate into Canadian culture, but actually that Canadian culture changes alongside. And that notion that Christine talked about, multiculturalism programs and policies, has really shaped the country, shaped the very fabric of our identity, but really opens the door to the two-way understanding and the ability for us to respond using trauma-informed practices in a way that really hears the newcomer, but also celebrates their differences and their uniqueness and what they bring and contribute to our society. I'll leave you on one of my favorite Statistics Canada, which is our federal statistics body research, which was done in 2017 on resettled refugee labor market outcomes. And one of the findings of this project found that it wasn't actually the adults that we resettled, but it was actually their children, that within 10 years of arriving in Canada, children of resettled refugees outperform Canadian-born children in the labor market. And I think that that statistic is one that myself, but also many other people that have advocated, including some of the groups like Refugee Career Jumpstart that's worked with the Global Compact group, they have often cited this statistic, because I think it really tells us that when we're intervening, yes, we're intervening to provide refugee protection in that area of our work, but we're actually the people that are really going to shape this community, the people that are going to make the difference in Canada, are the children of refugees, and they work really hard to shape their futures and to find success, and no better success than having a former Minister of Immigration himself being a resettled refugee. So with great pride, we wish you the best of luck in Chile as you go through this next phase of your very important work, and know that you have such great allies and supports here in Canada. We are definitely cheering you on from the sidelines.
Right then, Jose, you have the challenge to comment on this. I'll try not to respond and leave the 15 minutes for Q&A. So thank you very much for the opportunity of being here. It's a very interesting panel. Now, I'm going to take the questions, but I'll try not to respond to anybody, just to open new questions and new information. One of the elements that was asked about were the mechanisms in terms of integration. One general element that describes a migrant and immigrant is to feel lost in Chile. And what does this mean in Chile? It means even if you know people in the place, there's a great lack of so-called soft information, which is lost. They told me to bring a presentation, but sometimes in a presentation, I just screen cap a dialogue on WhatsApp of somebody that told me, asked me, do people go to school when it rains? And people answer, obviously. But that's an answer from somebody whose city works well with rain, which here in Santiago, we're not used to having complex storms. So that reflects social information, which isn't acquired immediately. It requires a support network. So another element that immigrants face, even though they're with people from the same country, there's a lack of information and a difficulty in acquiring information, and that affects the labor market because there's differences among immigrants in the sense, and this generates clusters, which we could also call sometimes ghetto if you wish to give it a harder connotation. So here they need to find references for rent, for work, and that is found in many places, not just for us, but this is found in many countries, larger countries, even Canada and the US. It observes that the same migrants are focused on one job, and that has to do with information. It's not that the Vietnamese are the best taxi drivers. It's just that in some city, for some reason, it happened that there's a concentration of those immigrants in that labor market. So that's the first element, the delivery of information. And I believe that the information can be centralized in the labor listing, and also the local governments. I believe that they can strongly lead integration of immigrants, and they have done so for a long time. I can name various municipalities in the north of Chile and center of Santiago that many were innovative, and much of this was done together with civil society and the private sector. I believe that these are elements that we can't close ourselves off to here. Any assimilation policy, and if we think of labor aspects, includes the third sector, the nonprofit NGOs and civil society, but they also must include the private sector because jobs are there. It's difficult to think of labor insertion with just nonprofits and the government. Where we are here, this is the third sector, it's part of the history. We must include them in the conversation, and this isn't so common in Chile to everybody get together and agree upon a point. This requires a community of efforts, and this can explain what's happened in the last 20 years that we've been talking about migration. I recall that the last 4 administrations before the current administration, all of them presented migration projects and none of them were approved. So this, we've seen it come. We sit down and we see the tsunami come. So we saw that it was growing and we were left discussing. I don't remember what we discussed back then, but we were trying to do our best. And then I feel the time went by to do and to have the best response. So there's a necessary upper level coordination, but there's also necessary local level coordination. And for example, the agreements on housing, this should include the third sector, because there's nothing better in migration than having the capacity of working together with migrant associations and with other local associations, not necessarily migrant associations, but those that hold a genuine interest in working with migrants. I believe that it's important to strengthen the capacity of local governments. And this isn't just about having only multicultural offices, but also to have all the local development and productive systems that can work on this. 5 minutes. First question. Next question. first message. And the second one, I believe, due to family, I have heard the news from, well, sports, and what's happened in sports is that there's a number of migrants, not just first generation, but now second generation of kids that for obvious generation, you know that they're not direct descendants of native Chileans. Everybody knows what I mean. The number of second generation immigrants in sports are higher, and there are certain sports more propense to immigrants. And if you see this for the Pan American Games, there's immigration in athleticism and sports. So I don't want to discuss what happened until now, but the conversation, this has been a conversation that has focused, and it was stated well by the director. The flow has been important, but migration also has stocks. I'm worried that we miss out on what doing with the migration stocks without having the correct response. I believe this is an opportunity. I don't want to turn second generation migrants into a utilitarian vision. I believe we need to just understand how we can contribute to society, and they're linked, of course. I get the feeling, though, that there's a topic there. There's already migrant families with families. The U.S. solved it with Dreamers, with the patch solution. Canada is doing much better with that tackling of that migration. Now, we've had economic migration, sometimes close to refugeeism, but we also have another challenge, which is family integration, and family integration can happen in the incoming or outgoing migrants. So, for example, we need to convalidate degrees, education. So there's qualification and validation that has been done well in education. Also, we need to talk about the amount of migrant workers allowed in companies, and also we need studies and work to be done in this. For example, there's people that have a doctorate from abroad and they couldn't sign a contract here because they didn't have a degree from Chile, for example. Just multiply this top to down of what and how many outcomes can happen. And some families say that we could have Chileans that migrate outward. So we have to think of what happens with people that leave and people that come. We have to talk about settlement, the second generation. The second generation are very important. And here, I believe we have to talk about economic integration, educational integration, to see what they're studying, how they're studying. So from now on, I think we need to manage migration that is in a not so rushed state, so we could improve the consular visas and others, and we could avoid this feeling that it was felt at some time, and it doesn't matter why it happened, but we need to see how we manage this from now on, how to work with the stock of migrants that we already have, which is significant, and we weren't used to this. So I think there's a political sense that will once again require a coordination from the central, regional, and municipal governments, especially the municipal governments. They have an important role because there's a lot of intermediation in jobs in Chile. If we don't come in, if we don't give capacity to them, we're going to be left lacking. And I believe working with the private sector is fundamental. Otherwise, it won't advance. Those are my comments. Right. Super. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. So we have a short Q&A and comments, always focused on how to create a more robust immigration system for the first and second generation migrants. Jose talked about a new aspect of the discussion, which has to do with how we integrate the second generations, which I believe that's a very important difference between Canada and Chile. that we're not used to having important levels of migration and to have a second generation of migrants. So we're just experimenting this at a large level. Christine or Monica, perhaps you wish to comment? Please go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, I spoke a bit about the importance of retention. So this is linking into this idea of second generation and those contributions into the society in general, but economically speaking, of course, the labor market. So this is why we have such a great focus on making sure that people have a strong sense of closeness to their community, of belonging. There's when I listed sort of the services that are available, you can see it's interwoven throughout this idea that you're not just kind of showing up for a language class. I mean, when a family arrives, they're provided with the needs and asset evaluation, and then they're set up for a suite of services and supports. And it's with that idea in mind that they definitely need language to be able to be successful, but they also need community connections and those types of things, the support services, childcare, so that they can get to some of these other courses that they need to take, that kind of thing. So it's this like wraparound society feel about our program that does lead to these successful outcomes in terms of that sense of belonging, that not feeling like the outsider, like almost a sense of entitlement that of course they should be able to have a job and be successful and put down roots in that community. And we do see that. I think these programs that I mentioned, a couple Monica spoke at, it's so inspiring to hear the on the ground success stories of how this actually plays out, from my kind of policy level, where we think of ideas and we sort of put things out there, but then people really bring that home and we see these successes. It's really inspiring. But that sense of belonging and that retention, that's what leads to this next generation and the generation after that are staying in the same communities. Some of these communities in Canada are very small, and so finding other people from your culture, maybe that there aren't that many, so you need to find another way to feel connected. And so that's why we're really bringing a lot of those wraparound services and supports to help people feel fully integrated. And then the next generation and the next generation, you're a permanent resident, you're potentially a Canadian at this point. So yes, we collect the data, which is incredibly important, to make sure that our policies are evidence-based. They're driving, our ability to iterate and adjust as we see different things happening. But at some point, we are all Canadians, so the generation after generation aspect of it kind of falls away from the perspective of the newcomer once they truly feel integrated.
You took most of what I said out of my head. So thank you, Christine, or what I was thinking out of my head. So that, you hit every point that I had written down when I was thinking about how to respond. But Jose made me laugh when he talked about, does everyone go to school when it rains in Chile? My best friend lives in Santiago, so I know exactly what you mean. But it's the same in Newfoundland. Like I'm second generation immigrant. My family lives in another part of Canada. But when I got to Newfoundland, it's very different here. When it snows to the roof of the houses. So immigrants often say, well, what do we do? How do we get out of our houses? How do we continue to function? And it is very much, as Jose suggested, not just about like the ABCs of how we do our work, but it is about that integrated community sense of belonging, right? Because when it snows up to the roofs in Newfoundland, the neighbors help out, and everyone rallies, whether it's for a newcomer or the neighbors, and we ourselves as an organization make sure that we check on the most vulnerable. And here I really wanted to hammer down that point that Christine just made about evidence-based practice. I think that's what our sector has done and has done really well. I've myself been working in the sector for 15 years, and I've watched myself the growth over time, right? And where in the 15 years ago, things like discussions around mental health weren't as common, discussions around how to serve high needs, complex cases that maybe don't follow the regular recipe for integration. And what I've seen from IRCC over this time is how we have grown through as our understanding of immigrants have grown and our work has become more complex, but in a wraparound integrated service model. So that basket that Christine talked about of services, we tap into all of those elements of the basket to do what I think is a really important point is not just a needs assessment. It's not just a what do you need help with kind of question. It's also an assets assessment. And that information I find more valuable. When we meet with a newcomer on day one of their time with us, we don't just ask them, how can we help you? We ask them, what are you bringing to the table? And we work with them to build on those assets. And that's very specific language that's built into the way that our evidence, our databases work with the government, but it also helps us capture what I think I can hear from those of you in Chile. What you're talking about is how do we address that the politics of it? How do we make sure that people understand that immigrants are contributing, and they're contributing in beautiful and important ways from the moment they land in our countries? And therein lies the beautifulness of the partnership between the local service provider and the federal government, because we couldn't do this without IRCC, without our provincial counterparts, but I also know they couldn't do this without us. And it's that marriage, that happy relationship that we work through brings us together and lets us work through even the most complex situations, like the Afghan movement, which I heard yesterday is the largest, most sustained Afghan resettlement initiative in the history of Canada. That was not an easy project, but it definitely was a collaborative one. I'll leave it there because I know there's other questions.
I'd like to give the mic to Luis Eduardo again, and perhaps making him react on how can we make progress, whether what are the main challenges or what main barriers to move on this, and taking some of the items we've mentioned, the importance of local governments, the importance of the private sector, the importance of the social sectors in improving the social labor integration of immigrants. I've got a microphone over here. Thank you. I'm going to tell what we're doing in that line and the point we started at. And there we are more or less in parallel with Canada. It is important to put our feet on the ground. Not only because of the difference of the immigration reality is important, but also because, as I said earlier, in terms of institutionality, government, society, there are differences that are undoubtful. Then good practices and replicability have to be taken very wisely and very carefully with reality in mind. We are in the state of the situation completely different to the one we could visualize in Canada or in any other developed country. We have an institutionality which is 1.5 years. We are about to turn 2 years. Then a first challenge we have in mind, and sorry for this, is to install institutionality. Before thinking about big systems to regulate, to govern in a better way immigrations, we have to set up institutionality, and there to keep our feet on the ground. In regional direction, we have 4 officers. In Arica, we have 8 officers. In Tarapacá, we have 15 officers. When we installed the service in Bio Bio, we had 2 officers. Then it is the first challenge to set up a new institutionality that didn't exist across the country. We have another challenge in parallel, which is normalize the national immigration services. What do I mean with this? adjusting the capacities, the budget to the needs. Very simple. It's a basic equation, but almost 600,000, the almost 600,000 requests not resolved and in progress we had in March 2022 when the new government came cannot be solved in the overnight because the capacities of the services are still the same. We have all the regularization process within the last 4 years, 2018 to 21, with the same capacities. There was an increase of the immigration flow with the same capacities then, and the main concern of immigrant communities is the resolution of their paperwork. It's not other than that. It's the resolution of their paperwork. Of course, we have to think about the system that their capacities that it go beyond the paperwork. But without that, we cannot move on, and we have an irregularity problem, which is very important. People who enter to the country irregularly, we are talking about historic terms. There's a number of people who have to make regular, and on the other hand, we have a irregularity on the law to the over demand of the services up to 600,000 applications in tramit that cannot be solved in the overnight with the same capacities. We add a new regulation, which is new for users and which is new for the society. Then there is, let's say, a factual irregularity, which is not regulatory. When a person, when the new law is in the law is there in the paperwork is regulated, there are also the permit to work. If the ID card is expired, they extend the validity, but no banks, no those who lease houses, no public notary publics don't know that there is a factual irregularity. People is recognizing the society that it is in a regular situation. We got, let's say, more basic challenges than what we can put in perspective today. And where we are putting the resources and our work is precisely on that discussion in terms of budget that we are taking now is precisely to achieve, to solve the delay of the non-resolved residencies up to this moment the next year. We've made a lot of progress, we've reduced times, but there's still outstanding issues. To install the new institutionality and the new regulation, some of the interventions were mentioned in consulates. We also have a role that the consulate network has to play, which is very important. We have to install that, and we also have to develop that capacity. We are strengthening institutionality through the installation and regularization of the service, but we are making progress in perspective too, because we have to set up that, and we have to institutionalize some things through agreements with public and private organizations. We have one with Chile and Corfu talking about advanced human capital. We have one with Crutch about the insertion of researchers, scholars, and students, foreign students at universities. And we're making progress with a series of other agreements. We're going to reinforce one, or we're going to sign one with ANID next week, talking about the scholarships, strengthening of capacities, the research capacities, and increase some productivity in that line. Then making progress in installation, regularization, and consolidation of networks, the institutional networks with local governments too. There is a program which is that it so far is a certification, and we want to make progress that certification ought to be a certification, but support with capacities, with support by local governments that play a key role in the integration process of immigrant people. And the other important thing that in order to make progress in this perspective of labor inclusion, it is having institutionalized accesses, ordinary accesses to regularity. Ordinary accesses to regularity. We assume the irregularity is a consequence of any immigration system, whether because of irregular entry or because of different things. We have to think about those things, and we have to establish our legal framework, in our legal framework, ordinary regularization mechanisms, and we are making progress in that sense with women, with children, with people who are pursued, talking about international protection, And we also want to establish certain criteria for extraordinary mechanism that will always be a tool available that are explicitly written in the policy. I think those are the challenges. Institutional strengthening and, let's say, consolidation of mechanism to guarantee regularity, and then we will start talking, and we are going to make progress in that line. But the idea is to put this in perspective of the challenges we have today. In any of these forums, when we talk about the public reality, where we make known to the public, there are always 2 or 3 things that are related. When my paperwork is resolved, 2 or 3 questions, because it's the current concern by people, it's our concern, and we are all day long on this, and the efforts are focused on that line. Of course, and I'm going to wrap up with this, we have to make progress in the consolidation of a system of punishments. It is not nice talking about this, but a system of punishment that guarantees the system of rights, because without punishment systems having the capacity of defense as a state, we will fall again in violation of rights or non-implementation of sanctions. There's some sort of control and border control system that is efficient, that guarantees human rights. It is recognized by the whole society being a valid and legitimate system. We want to have that very well installed. Okay, thank you. In honor of time, I have to wrap up. I also wanted to thank all the people who presented. This dialogue will be available on YouTube. Let's hope it helps to the contribution. I think we have to learn from compared experiences, and it is in evidence we have a lot to learn from the Canadian experience, and hopefully you could also follow the Chilean case. That I think, unlike Canada, one of the big differences of the immigrant phenomenon is the speed of the flow of immigrants. The first chart you showed, Christine, is you have a history of immigration we actually don't have. That's why I think we have to learn this more quickly. That's one of the big issues. I think it's been noticeable. Let's hope we move on that dialogue. Thank you, all those who have participated, those who are connected from abroad. See you soon.